The afternoon light over Clarence's house fell in long pale slants across the polished oak table, and for a moment the room looked like every other formal room in the long history of the British monarchy. Quiet, ordered, sealed in ritual. 4 chairs, 2 teacups, a folder, closed, a name on a folder that until seconds ago no one in the room had expected to say out loud. Then Princess Anne set her cup down, and the sound it made against the saucer was barely a sound at all. But it was the sound of a door being opened, of a corridor the palace had spent years learning not to walk down, of a question that should never have been asked anyway. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. What she did, place a single piece of paper on the table, slide it forward 3 inches, and wait. In simple words, what sat on that paper was a property record, a paper trail that on any other afternoon would have been nothing more than an administrative detail. A villa, a region, a name. But that day, in that room, with those hands touching it, it was not a record. It was a confession in disguise. It was the thinnest edge of a much heavier wall. Before we go deeper into what this really means, take a moment. If this story is giving you the kind of clarity that most outlets never do, subscribe to the channel. The next chapters will go even further. What Anne had not done was accuse. What she had done was name, and there is a difference in royal spaces that the public rarely understands. To accuse is to attack, to name is to remember. Anne had chosen to remember. In that single gesture, the long, carefully managed silence around Camilla, the silence the palace had maintained for years, the silence the press had been trained to respect, the silence even Charles himself had learned to live inside, cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. The room did not erupt, it froze. You could feel it in the body language of the advisors, in the slight tilt of a head, in the white-knuckled stillness of a senior press officer whose fingers hovered 3 inches above a phone he was afraid to touch. Because if this image got out, if even one frame of this moment leaked, the monarchy would face a question it had not faced in living memory. Not a question of scandal, a question of inheritance. Of whose story gets a room and whose story gets a cellar. Of whose face gets to enter through the front door and whose face learns to use the side entrance. This was not a property. It was a verdict, and Anne had just read it aloud. Let us slow this moment down. Let us feel the weight of the air. Because what happened in that room was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of grammar. Anne was correcting the sentence the monarchy had been writing for 2 decades. She was not demanding something new. She was insisting that the sentence as it stood was a lie. And at the center of that lie was a house, a Provençal villa, hidden behind olive trees and high stone walls, an estate the public had never been told about, an estate that allegedly belonged to the Queen consort through a holding registered in a quiet corner of France. A villa in plain terms is just a piece of land, a roof, 4 walls. But a villa purchased through a holding, registered in the name of someone else, used by someone else, paid for by someone adjacent to the throne, that is not a building. That is an architecture of intent. To the public, an estate like that might mean nothing. A house is a house. To Camilla, it seems to have meant refuge. To Charles, it appears to have meant privacy. To Anne, it meant a betrayal of memory. To the late Queen, in her final, unspoken language, it might have meant something quite different. A slow, silent repositioning of the family's emotional center of gravity toward a new axis. Every house has one meaning to the person who lives in it, and a different meaning to the person who cannot enter it. Anne could not enter this one. Not because she lacked the keys. Because she had not been invited, and in royal protocol, an invitation is not a courtesy. It is a recognition. To not invite the king's sister to a family home is to draw a line. To not invite the princess royal to a residence that holds significant wealth is to redraw a story. To Anne, who has lived her entire life inside the architecture of duty, the absence of that invitation was not slight. It was structural. Across the table from her, a senior courtier understood this in the same instant. He lowered his eyes, not in shame, in recognition. He knew they all knew what was happening. The monarchy was watching one of its own turn from participant into witness. Not against Charles, against the shape of the future Charles was allowing to form. And that is when the second meaning of the moment emerged, the one no one outside those walls could yet see. This was not just about Anne and Camilla, it was about Anne and Charles. About sister and brother. About the oldest, most disciplined, most silent woman in the bloodline refusing at last to be silent. Her silence had been her gift to the family for decades. Now she had chosen to break it. To understand why this moment carries the weight it does, we must step back, not months, not a year, decades. Because the present crisis did not begin with Anne setting down her teacup. It began with a single earlier moment, a moment almost no one outside the inner circle remembers. And within that earlier moment lies the entire architecture of what we are watching now. We travel back then to a private afternoon years earlier. The location, for the purposes of this retelling, does not need to be specific. The setting suffices: an upstairs sitting room, lamplight, 2 chairs, a window overlooking a courtyard, Anne and Charles, no one else. A conversation that was meant to remain a conversation. A warning that was meant to remain a warning. Anne had spoken plainly. In simple words, what she had said was this: protect the memory, or it will be quietly traded for comfort. Build a private world inside the institution, and the institution will love you less for it. Allow another voice to redraw the shape of the family's history, and the family's history will forget you sooner than you think. She did not name Camilla that afternoon. She did not need to. The room understood. Charles had listened. Charles had nodded. Charles had done what Charles often does in moments of pressure. He had deferred. He had softened the warning into a suggestion. He had treated the warning as if it were a weather report rather than a structural diagnosis, and then he had done nothing. This is the moment we must hold on to, because this was the first warning, the first refusal, the first time a member of the bloodline directly told the future king that the future he was building would cost the family the memory it was supposed to protect. And Charles, in his own gentle, deeply human way, had chosen to be polite about it rather than prevent it. And that earlier refusal, that quiet, gentle, well-mannered refusal, is exactly why we are now standing in the formal sitting room, watching Anne set a property document on the table. She did not come to this moment suddenly. She came to it the way a stone comes to the bottom of a river. Slowly, quietly, through decades of pressure that no one outside the palace could fully see. By the time the public first learned that Camilla had been quietly integrated into the routines of Windsor and Sandringham, Anne had already grieved privately. Not because she resented Camilla as a person. Her grief was deeper than personal. Anne grieved because the institution that had taught her since she was a child that duty outlasted affection was now being asked to put affection ahead of duty. The Queen Mother had lived that principle. The late Queen had lived it. Princess Margaret, in her own turbulent way, had lived it. Anne had lived it every single day, even on the days when her own public standing did not match her private sacrifice. Camilla, in the unspoken grammar of the monarchy, had been invited to live a different grammar entirely. A villa, registered through a third party, in a country the Windsors have historically avoided as a residence, was not just a financial maneuver. It was an answer to an emotional question Charles had carried for years. Where can I be myself away from the institution, in the company of the person I chose long before I was allowed to choose her publicly? That is a deeply human question. It is also, in royal terms, a structural one. Because when a future monarch builds a private world that the family cannot enter, the family begins to lose its institutional right to shape him. Anne understood this. Anne had warned about this. Anne had watched it happen in slow motion. And now, in this formal room, with this piece of paper, she was simply done being quiet about it. Her gesture that afternoon was not cruel. It was corrective. Every monarchy needs a witness who is willing to remember the original promise. Anne is that witness. She had watched her mother bury her private feelings so that the crown could remain coherent. She had watched her father carry the institution through crisis after crisis. She had watched her sister Margaret live the cost of the crown's emotional geometry, and for decades, she had done her part without complaint. Now she was asking, in the quietest possible way, whether the family still remembered the original promise, and the room knew the answer was no. The paper on the table was a piece of evidence. But it was also a question, not is this true, but why was it hidden? Not who paid, but why was the family kept outside? Not is this legal, but is this loyal? In simple words, what Anne was asking Charles, through the paper, through the silence, through the body language, was, did you choose the institution, or did you choose comfort? Did you choose duty, or did you choose escape? The room, of course, could not answer that. The room could only receive the question. Charles, across the table, did not move for several seconds. His hands remained folded. His eyes did not avoid Anne's. This is important. Charles did not look away. Charles has always had a strange, soft dignity in moments of pressure, a dignity his critics rarely credit. He knows, when caught, that the only honest posture is the still one. He did not speak. His silence was not denial. It was something heavier. It was the fun silence of a man who understood in that precise second that his sister had not invented anything. That the paper on the table was simply the visible shape of a private geography that had been growing for years. A geography the family had not been invited to see. A geography Anne had warned him about. A geography he had been too polite, too gentle, too loyal to his own marriage to confront. And so for a few seconds the room held two silences at once. Anne's silence, "I told you." Charles's silence, "I know you did." Then the press officer moved, not dramatically. He simply reached for a glass of water. The gesture was professional. The gesture was also a warning, because the press officer knew that what had just happened in that room was no longer containable inside the palace. The signal had been given. Anne had used the document not to leak it but to authorize it. By placing it on the table in front of witnesses, she was telling the system, "I am no longer protecting this." A leak, in simple terms, is when information escapes without permission. What Anne had done was open the gate deliberately, which means that within hours, the information about the villa would move. Not as gossip, not as rumor, as a fact. A fact with an address, a fact with a region, a fact with the name of a holding company. A fact that would eventually reach journalists, who would eventually reach readers, who would eventually reach a public already tired of being told that the monarchy is one thing while behaving as another. But the public reaction would not be the real crisis. The real crisis would be the institutional one. Because the monarchy is not built on facts, the monarchy is built on the management of facts. And Anne had just taken an unmanageable fact and placed it in the open. In real terms, this is not a leak. It is a breach of protocol so deep that the institution itself begins to shift. Camilla, for her part, would not learn the precise detail of what had been said in that room for hours. But she would feel it. As wives in royal marriages often do, she would feel the silence before she heard the words. A small change in protocol, a shift in seating, a hesitation in a phone call, a new arrangement that had not been requested. Camilla would know intuitively that something had happened between Charles and Anne. Not because Anne had betrayed her, but because Anne had stopped shielding her. She had stopped being the silent gear in the family machine. And in royal families, the moment a silent gear speaks, the machine sounds different. By the next morning, the first reports would begin, not in the form of accusations, in the form of questions, carefully constructed, calm, measured questions. The kind of questions that in a free press do more damage than headlines. Where is the property? Who owns it? Why was it not declared? Why was it hidden from public view? Why is the king's sister speaking? And when did she know it? Each question, in plain terms, is a small chisel against a wall. Pressed together, they become a door. The wider public reaction would not be one of rage. It would be one of a slow, exhausted recognition. The public, after all, has been here before. They have watched the monarchy release carefully managed versions of itself for 2 decades. Marriage announcements, coronation rituals, walkabouts, soft photo opportunities, controlled grief. And through all of it, the public has known, in some inarticulate way, that what they were seeing was a curated version. This moment would feel different, not because it was larger, because it felt more honest. When Anne speaks through a property record, she is not speaking as a commentator. She is speaking as the family's memory. And the public understands, often without being able to name it, that when the family's memory opens its mouth, the institution's voice has changed. The narrative would soon widen. Commentators would weigh in. Some would defend Camilla as a woman who wanted a private life. Some would defend Charles as a man who wanted a quiet space. A few would defend Anne as the family's conscience. Many would ask the uncomfortable question, if the monarchy can keep secrets of this size, how many has it already kept? A villa, registered through a holding, escapes the public ledger. That is what a holding, in simple terms, is. It is the legal architecture of invisibility. The rich and the powerful use them to keep certain lives out of view. Anne had pointed at this architecture in front of a senior courtier. She had pointed at it without speaking. She had pointed at it knowing exactly what it meant. By the second day, the palace would be forced into a conventional response. A spokesperson would offer a calm, prepared, deeply royal sentence, something about private family matters, respect for privacy, the king's right to a personal life. The spokesperson would be technically correct. The spokesperson would also be irrelevant, because by then, the public would have moved beyond the question of whether Charles has bought a house. They would be asking whether Charles had built a separate family inside the family. The institution of monarchy, in simple words, is the long, slow ritual by which a country agrees to recognize one family as its symbolic center. It depends not on wealth, but on visible cohesion. It depends not on perfection, but on presence. When a monarch builds a private geography his family cannot enter, the institution begins to lose its center of gravity. And Anne, who has spent her entire life protecting that center of gravity, would have been the one to see it disappear. First, her gesture, then, was not an attack on her brother. It was a defense of the institution her mother had died protecting. This is why the moment felt sacred to those who saw it. This is why it felt heavy. This is why the press officer reached for a glass of water instead of a phone. Because what had happened was not a scandal, it was a moral accounting. Charles, for his part, would not retreat into performance. He would not issue a defensive statement. He would, in his own way, absorb the moment. He would know, somewhere deep, that his sister had been right to warn him. He would know, somewhere deeper, that he had been wrong to be polite about her warning. And he would carry the weight of that knowledge with the particular dignity of a man who has learned, late, that gentleness is not always a virtue. In royal families, gentleness can be a kind of cowardice. The late Queen understood this. Anne understands this. Charles has spent his life learning it. Anne had not come to this moment as a rival. She came to this moment as a witness. A witness, in simple terms, is a person who sees something others have agreed not to see. The witness does not invent. The witness does not exaggerate. The witness simply refuses, for moral reasons, to keep the secret. This is the grammar Anne used that afternoon. And this is the grammar the public, slowly, will come to recognize. The fallout in the days that follow will not be theatrical. It will not be loud. It will be institutional. Because the monarchy does not explode. It adjusts. A small change in who attends which lunch, a small change in seating at a charity event, a small change in the private office around Charles, a new advisor perhaps who is more aware of legacy, more aware of memory, more aware that the institution cannot survive another quiet geography. Camilla herself in private will respond in a way that only those closest to her will see. She will not weep, she will not rage. She will simply withdraw tactically into the most manageable form of dignity the palace allows her. She will attend fewer events by herself. She will allow a rebalancing. She will, in her own restrained way, understand that what Anne did was not betrayal. It was the cost of being grafted late onto a family whose memory has already decided who it trusts. The wider country will register this not as theater, but as weather. The front pages will print calm questions. The columnists will write their measured essays. The broadcasters will assemble their gray panels of former courtiers, half concerning, half denying, every one of them performing the small national ritual of pretending to know what is happening behind walls they have not seen. And through it all, one steady image will remain fixed in the public mind. A teacup set down without sound on a polished oak table in a room where a sister refused, at last, to be polite about her brother's silence. That single image will do more political work than any speech Charles could deliver in the coming months. Because, in the silent language of the monarchy, gesture carries more weight than sentence. A nod can ratify a treaty, a bow can end a dynasty, a teacup, set down with restraint, can redraw the geometry of the family for a generation. What Anne did that afternoon was not improvisation, it was liturgy. She performed in private the public function her mother had carried for 7 decades, the function of remembering on behalf of the country what the institution is for. She did it without a crown. She did it without a throne. She did it with a piece of paper and a cup of tea. And the room understood, and the public with time would understand. Because the question Anne raised was not about a villa. A house can be bought, sold, registered, transferred. The question was about loyalty, about whether a king who has sworn himself to the symbolic life of a nation is permitted, in secret, to construct a separate symbolic life in the south of France, about whether the crown can hold 2 centers of gravities at once, about whether the family that the country recognizes is still the family the king recognizes in private. These are the questions the monarchy has spent decades avoiding. They are also the questions, on closer inspection, the country has been quietly asking for years, under its breath, in its polling, in the slow erosion of trust that has been visible for a generation, in every survey and every front page and every half-whispered conversation in pubs and parliaments. Anne did not invent those questions, she simply gave them a table. And once a question has been given a table, it cannot be ungiven. It can only be answered. Quietly, slowly, in the long institutional grammar the monarchy knows better than any other family in the world. That is the meaning of the moment. Not the villa, the table. And then, in the long quiet after the moment, we return to Anne, not in public, in the place where she is most herself. Barns, horses, the long morning routines of a woman who has spent her life earning the right to be quiet. But the quiet now is different. It is quieter. Because Anne has done the thing the family asked her not to do. She has remembered publicly. She has placed a private geography on a public table. She has done what the late Queen, in her final unspoken language, would have done. She has protected the institutional memory even at the cost of her own peace. And in royal families, that is not a small thing, that is the whole thing. The lasting boundary that forms in the days and weeks after that afternoon is not a rule, it is a recognition. The recognition that the monarchy cannot survive a private world so large that the family itself can be locked out of it. The recognition that the Princess Royal, who never sought the crown, who never cultivated image, who never demanded affection, is the one who has remembered, aloud, what the crown is for. A crown, in simple words, is a promise. A promise to the country that the symbolic family will protect the continuity of memory. Anne had not protected the crown that afternoon. She had remembered its original promise, and in doing so she had drawn a boundary that the family cannot redraw. This was not a leak. This was not a scandal. This was not a feud. This was a daughter of the bloodline, telling her brother the truth he had asked her not to tell. And it was in that room, with that paper, with that teacup, with that silence, the most royal act the monarchy has performed in years. The verdict is simple. The boundary is clear. The geometry of memory has shifted, and the woman who carried that memory into the room did not raise her voice. She did not need to. If this story gave you the kind of clarity most outlets never deliver, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and come back for the next one because what happens next will go even deeper.